Winter 1906 did not protect anyone. Not the towns wrapped in coal smoke, not the farms buried in drifting fields, and not children who learned to sleep without warmth when fires died before dawn. How children stayed warm in the frost of 1906. Sounds gentle until you learn the truth. You wake as one of those children, breath turning white in a room without light, your blanket stiff from ice, your shoes frozen to the floor. You wait for footsteps in the hall because the stove needs tending and the night stretches longer than your strength. This is not a tale of comfort. It is the quiet fight to keep small hands alive through the longest cold month in memory. This story follows a young girl named Ellen Harper who lived in a narrow wooden house on the edge of a fading coal town. Her mother worked in the boarding house kitchen, leaving before dawn each day. Her father traveled with rail crews and returned only when tracks cleared. Ellen cared for her younger brother during long winter nights, collecting fallen branches from frozen alleys and watching stove sparks fade before morning. Supplies ran thin after a train shipment stalled beyond the ridge, and families shared coats, quilts, and heated bricks to stay warm. The frost pushed under doors, through window cracks, and across floors like slow-moving glass. Before we settle in, tell me where you are listening from and what time your night begins. Pull a blanket close. Let your shoulders drop, breathe slow, and let the cold outside stay far. Rest your hands, find a quiet posture, and let this story move at your pace. If you feel comfort here, leave a small like, subscribe softly, and write a gentle note in the comments. No rush. We start together. Ellen woke before dawn. Frost covered the inside of the small window beside her bed. Thin lines spread across the glass like threads pulled tight. She pulled her quilt closer, though the cloth felt stiff from the night. Her brother, Thomas, lay beside her, curled under a patched blanket their mother stitched last autumn. His breath shallow, his hands tucked under his chin to keep warmth in. Ellen sat up slowly, the room silent except for the wind pressing faintly against the outer boards. She placed her bare feet on the floor and pulled them back at once. The wood iced over in the night. She reached under her blanket for the small cloth shoe she placed there before sleeping. They warmed from her body heat through the night. She slipped them on and rose. The door to the main room creaked when she opened it. She stepped into the narrow hallway and walked toward the stove. No embers remained, only cold iron she pressed. A hand against the side and felt nothing. She knelt, opened the lower grate, and scraped ashes into a small box. She saved every bit since her mother said ash helped spread heat when coal ran low. She searched the wood bin. Only 2 small pieces left. Thin, not enough for full warmth. She placed them aside and opened the door to the yard. A sheet of snow covered the ground, not deep but hard. She crossed to the fence and pried a few broken branches loose from a pile they gathered weeks before. They snapped in her hands, brittle and narrow. She stacked them in her arms and walked back inside. Thomas stirred in the doorway. He rubbed his eyes and asked if morning started. Ellen nodded. She told him to sit near the quilts until the fire built. He sat on a cushion near the wall, pulling blankets around his shoulders. Ellen arranged wood in the stove. Thin branches first, then the last 2 larger pieces. She struck flint and bent close, blowing slow, controlled breaths until sparks caught. The flame grew small, then steady. Heat spread from the iron surface, subtle at first, Thomas moved closer, the house quiet. No movement from outside. Their mother already left for work. She always walked to the boarding house before dawn to help prepare breakfast for miners who stayed there. She left a note the night before, folded under a salt jar on the table. Ellen unfolded it now. Her mother wrote that the coal deliveries still delayed and to check on Mrs. Harley next door since her husband worked night shifts at the mill. El, and folded the note and placed it beside the salt jar again. Thomas asked if he could help. She told him to check the windows for open gaps where frost crept in. He moved from frame to frame, pushing cloth strips into cracks. Outside, the sky turned pale blue, though the sun still hidden. Smoke plumes low above houses where families started. Breakfast fires. No horse carts moved on the street yet. Snow-covered ruts from the day before. Ellen wrapped a scarf around her neck and stepped outside again. She closed the door tight so heat stayed inside. She walked down the narrow path between houses, boots crunching against thin ice. The air burned her cheeks. She kept hands under her coat, fingers pressed against pockets. Mrs. Hale's house stood second from the corner. A lantern hung beside. The front door, flame nearly out. Ellen knocked. The door opened partway. Mrs. Hale looked tired but smiled weakly. Ellen asked if she needed help with her stove. Mrs. Hale nodded and stepped aside. Inside, the house colder than her own. They walked to the back room where two children slept under one quilt. Mrs. Holler set a woodpile low and her husband still at the mill. Ellen walked to the stove and cleared ash from the bottom. She broke thin branches across her knee and placed them inside. The flame caught slow. Mrs. Holly thanked her and offered a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. Ellen said she would pick more branches from the yard on the way home. When she left the house, wind picked up. Snow swirled around her boots. She crossed the lot behind Mrs. Hale's home, where a row of old crates leaned against a shed. She pulled loose broken slats and laid them in a pile. She could only carry a small bundle, so she stacked the rest. In a corner for later. Back home, Thomas sat close to the stove, reading a worn children's book. Ellen placed the new wood beside the wall. She sliced the loaf into 3 pieces and handed one to Thomas. He ate slow, crust flaking across his hands. The fire warmed the room enough to move freely. Ellen washed dishes left from last night, hands stiff from cold water. She dried them and placed them on the shelf near the window. She folded quilts on chairs too warm for the night ahead. Thomas asked if they would visit town to look for coal. Ellen nodded. She told him they would leave once the fire strong enough to last without constant tending. They waited another hour, adding thin branches slowly. Then Ellen bundled Thomas in his coat and handed him his scarf. She placed a small tin of coins in her pocket, saved from sewing work her mother completed last fall. They stepped onto the street. Snow crunched beneath their feet. Other families walked toward the center of town, faces hidden under scarves. A few children carried pots to fill with warm broth from the church kitchen. The pastor opened doors early for those low on supplies. Elin. And Thomas walked past brick buildings lining the main street. The general store roof covered in fresh snow. A wagon stood outside with empty coal sacks stacked in the back. The storekeeper swept snow from steps. Ellen asked if coal shipments arrived. He shook his head. The train still trapped beyond the ridge after wind-buried tracks on the east side. Workers tried to clear but progressed slow. He offered small sticks and peat for a reduced price. Ellen bought one bundle of peat, knowing it burned slower than wood though not strong enough for the whole night. Thomas pointed to the train station platform. A single man stood there, wrapped in thick coats, stamping his boots to stay warm. Ellen walked closer, hoping for news. The man said he heard no whistle in 3 days. He stared down the tracks as if waiting for movement beyond the hill. Ellen thanked him and led Thomas away. They walked past the mill where steam vents pushed faint. Clouds through metal pipes. Workers moved slowly, breaths heavy. They greeted Ellen with tired nods. She stopped by a fence to pick up small splinters where barrels broke the day before. By midday, they returned home. The stove still held heat but not strong. She placed peat inside, feeding the flame. Thomas laid his coat near the stove so it dried before evening. Afternoon light faded early. Frost climbed windows again. Ellen wrapped quilts around the frame near the door to keep cold out. She placed 2 heated bricks under their blankets, warmed earlier next to the stove. Thomas fell asleep quickly, his breath softer now. Ellen sat near the stove, listening to faint crackles inside. Her hands wrapped around a metal cup filled with warm water. She watched the flame through the open grate until her eyes heavy. Outside, wind moved through narrow streets. Snow shifted lightly across roofs. The night long again, but Ellen kept watch. Ellen woke when Thomas stirred beside her. Frost clung to the quilt edges, thin and sharp. The stove burned low, but held a faint ember, enough to rebuild the fire without starting from nothing. She pushed herself up, feet sore from walking the day before. She checked Thomas's forehead, warm, not fevered, his breath steady. She crossed the room and opened the stove door. Ash slumped forward. A small red glow hid beneath it. She used a long iron spoon to pull embers together, then placed a handful of thin slats from yesterday's crate pile across the top. She blew slow breaths until sparks caught. The flame rose weak but steady. Heat crept through the room in slow waves. Thomas pulled on his shoes and wrapped the blanket around his shoulders while Ellen warmed water from a tin pitcher. She poured a little into 2 metal cups and crushed a bit of dried root inside his cup to help his chest, something their mother left on the shelf for cold mornings. He sipped quietly. The house felt heavier today, the air still. The walls creaked from cold settling deeper into wood. Ellen listened for footsteps outside, hoping to hear workers clearing snow near the mill. Instead, she heard nothing but distant wind sliding along rooftops. She checked the cloth strip wedged in the window frame. Frost seeped through again. She pressed the strip tighter, then wrapped the bottom edge with a quilt scrap. Thomas watched her and asked if they would search the rail yard. She nodded. If the train still stuck beyond the ridge, someone near the yard might know when crews planned to clear tracks. Ellen packed a small sack with bread crust, the last of Mrs. Hale's loaf, and a piece of salt pork wrapped in cloth. She handed Thomas his scarf and mittens. He reached for her hand as they stepped outside. Morning light, thin and flat. Snow covered the path from door to street in an even sheet. Their footprints from yesterday filled overnight. They walked the main road, passing neighbors clearing steps with weak shovels. Smoke from chimneys hung low, unable to rise high through cold air. Ellen nodded to familiar faces, though no one spoke long. Everyone saved breath in weather like this. At the church, volunteers handed small bowls of broth to families waiting in line. Ellen saw the pastor speaking to an older man holding his grandson close. She waved but did not stop. The rail yard waited farther north, near the riverbank. They reached the narrow bridge leading across frozen water. Ice thick below, but Ellen guided Thomas along the planks instead of stepping onto ice itself. The rail yard entrance stood on the far side, marked by a tall post where a faded lamp hung dot tracks stretched into distance, disappearing behind the ridge. Several workers gathered near a stalled engine covered in frost, its wheels sunk halfway into hardened snow. Steam valves quiet, the engine cold. Ellen approached one worker lighting a pipe. He looked tired, eyes half closed, hands cracked from long shifts. She asked if the freight train from the east moved yet. He shook his head. Snow on the far bend deeper than expected. Wheel housings froze. The crew sent horses to help clear, but wind knocked them back before they reached the ridge. The man leaned closer and said to families stuck near the train for shelter since they lacked fuel to walk back. Ellen tightened her grip on Thomas's hand. She asked if workers planned to try again today. The man shrugged, then looked toward to other workers adjusting metal rods near the engine. He said they waited for coal from another town to fire the locomotive. Without that, nothing moved. She thanked him and stepped back. Thomas looked up, eyes wide. He asked if families on the ridge needed warmth. Ellen nodded slowly. She walked to the far edge of the yard where empty crates piled in stacks taller than her. She lifted loose slats and placed them into her sack. She grabbed a small bundle of rope left beside a broken wagon. These items proved useful later. They walked back across the bridge. Halfway through, Ellen stopped and looked toward the ridge. Snow clouds gathered behind it, thick and heavy. Another storm forming. She knew time shrinking. If families remained near the train, they needed heat before wind returned. At home, the stove still warm. She added peat to preserve it. Thomas sat at the table, cutting cloth strips from old shirts, making extra insulation for their boots. Ellen praised him softly. She packed supplies into a larger sack, cloth strips, rope, crate pieces, a tin cup, and a lantern with half a wick. She told Thomas he would stay with Mrs. Hale until she returned. His mouth tightened. He asked to go. She shook her head. The ridge farther than town. Wind sharper there. He lowered his gaze and agreed. She wrapped her arms around him and held him until he relaxed. They stepped outside together. Snow fell light, swirling in gentle spirals. Mrs. Hale opened her door when they approached, ushering Thomas inside. She promised to keep him near the stove and feed him broth. Ellen thanked her and stepped away. Alone now, Ellen followed the main road toward the ridge. Few people passed, most houses quiet. Wind pushed cold across her face. She kept her eyes lowered to watch footing. The road narrowed as it reached the base of the hill. Lantern posts stood dark from night before. She climbed slowly. Each step pressed deep, snow heavier at higher ground, breath sharp in throat. Cloth around her neck stiffened with frost. She paused at a flat ledge to rest. She looked back toward town. Smoke drifted, soft and low. The church steeple, small but clear. She drew warmth from sight, then turned and continued. The ridge path curved between two tall pines. Their branches held thick clumps of snow. Beyond them, the wind grew stronger. She lowered her head and leaned into it. Tracks appeared ahead, wagon wheels frozen in place, ruts filled with new snow. She followed, A broken lantern lay half buried beside a drift. She picked it up, shook out snow, and tied it to her sack. She walked farther until she reached the top of the ridge. Below, the valley dipped toward frozen tracks. The freight train sat still, metal coated in ice. A few figures moved around it, slow and tired. Thick blankets hung from windows to block wind. Ellen lifted her hand. A woman near the first car noticed and waved weakly. Ellen descended carefully, boots slipping on hardened slopes. When she reached the tracks, the woman spoke with cracked voice. They ran out of dry wood 2 nights ago. They burned box parts from crates pulled off the train, heat gone by morning. Ellen handed her the rope and wood pieces. She told her to wrap cloth around vents inside cars to trap heat. The woman called another man from inside. He carried pots to gather snow for melting. They thanked Ellen with tired faces. Ellen moved along cars, checking each family. Some looked shivering. Some slept. Children lay wrapped in coats. She handed cloth strips to wrap hands and feet. She gave the lantern to an older man tending fire outside the engine. He nodded, face marked by frost, as she worked. Wind rose. Snow swept across tracks in long ribbons. The sky dimmed with clouds gathering strength. Ellen looked up and knew she had to leave before full storm began. Before she left, she told the woman she would return with more wood if paths stayed open. The woman squeezed her wrist once, silent but grateful. Ellen climbed the ridge again, slower this time. She kept hands pressed against snow for balance. When she reached the top, she turned back. The train stood small against white, but smoke rose now from one patched stove. She allowed herself one long breath, then walked home. Snow thickened by the time she reached Mrs. Hale's house. She opened the door and found Thomas asleep, wrapped in blankets beside the stove. Mrs. Hale handed Ellen warm broth and told her the boy helped carry wood inside. Night fell heavy. Wind pressed hard against walls. Ellen sat near the stove, feeding peat into the flame. Thomas curled close to her side. Outside, the storm grew, but the fire stayed alive. Wind arrived before full dark. It slipped through alleys, scraped along tin roofs, and pushed snow against doors until hinges rattled. Ellen set an extra log of wood against the threshold so it stayed shut. Thomas pulled quilts around his shoulders, sitting close enough to the stove that his socks steamed lightly from melted frost. The storm outside moved without pause. Snow struck the windows in steady bursts. At moments it felt as if the house leaned under its weight, then settled again. The lantern on the table flickered from stray drafts. Ellen placed a jar beside its base to shield the flame. Mrs. Hale visited near dusk, wrapped in 2 coats, face flushed from wind. She brought a tin container filled with boiled potatoes. Ellen invited her inside and handed her the warmest chair. They spoke quietly so Thomas could rest. Mrs. Hale said the mill shut down early after workers struggled against drifting snow. The night shift cancelled. Her husband stayed home. She asked if Ellen still planned to return to the ridge when weather cleared. Ellen nodded. Mrs. Hale placed her hand on Ellen's shoulder. Grateful though, she said nothing else. When she left, Ellen watched her disappear into snow. The wind carried her footsteps away until only silence remained. Inside, the fire burned steady. Thomas leaned against Ellen's side, eyes half closed. She stroked his hair softly, letting him settle. When he drifted asleep, she lifted him carefully and carried him to their bedding in the corner. She tucked quilts around his feet, placing warm bricks beneath the covers. She stood there a moment, watching him breathe. His cheeks pale from cold, but his chest rose steady. Ellen moved to the front window and peered outside. Houses across the street lit faintly. Snow piled along roofs and fences. A group of men walked past carrying lanterns toward the church. They spoke low, heads bowed, shoulders pressed forward. She opened the door and called to them. They stopped. One man said the church needed extra blankets for families who lost heat when chimneys clogged. The wind pushed smoke back into some homes. Ellen pointed them toward old quilts stored under her bed. They carried them off without delay. She closed the door. The night deepened. Hours passed. The storm did not break. The stove held heat, though wood supply thinned faster than she expected. She set more crate slats beside it, preparing for the long stretch before dawn. The room shook again as wind drove snow against outer boards. A loud crack sounded near the back wall, not inside, but close enough to make Ellen step toward it. She lifted her lantern and walked to the back room. The window frame strained under weight of snow piled against it from outside. Cold seeped through a narrow gap along the left edge. She pressed her palm against it. The air spilled in like a narrow stream. She grabbed a quilt strip and pushed it into the crack, then nailed 2 small boards across the frame to hold pressure. The draft slowed. She returned to the main room. The lantern flickered again. She tightened the wick and placed the jar closer. She sat by the stove, knees to her chest, hands folded across her coat. She listened. Wind roared. Snow struck. The world outside held no shape except movement. Thomas stirred again, calling her name quietly. She moved to him, placing her hand on his cheek. He asked if morning soon. She told him to sleep more. He nodded, wrapped himself tighter, and drifted again. Ellen's eyes grew heavy, but she forced herself to stay awake. Nights like this did not forgive sleep at the wrong moment. Fire needed tending. Frozen branches collapsed under snow weight. Doors shifted in frames. She watched each shadow at some point near deep night. The wind eased enough to hear faint footsteps outside, slow, plodding, not many. She blew out the lantern flame so no light leaked through windows. She moved to the door and pressed her ear against the wood. The footsteps stopped outside her home. A knock came, soft but urgent. She hesitated only a moment before unbolting the door. A man stood there with a boy younger than Thomas, both drenched in snow, clothes stiff with ice, their faces red from windburn. The man said their stove collapsed when the chimney cracked under snow weight. Smoke filled the house. They left quickly, walking toward any house with light. Ellen stepped aside and ushered them in. She helped the boy remove his wet coat and placed him near the stove. The man sat on the floor, legs shaking from long effort. Ellen handed them bread and warm water. The boy drank fast, then slowed when she touched his wrist gently. She asked where their home stood. The man pointed south, near the mill. She nodded. That house, small, walls thin. Snow drifted heavy in that part of town where open fields let wind gather speed. She laid 2 blankets beside the stove and told them to rest. They slept almost instantly. The fire burned low again. She added peat slowly. The room warmed more than before. The house filled with soft breaths of sleeping bodies. By dawn, the wind stopped. Snow piled high against doors and fences. Ellen opened the door carefully, pushing against weight. Cold air spilled in, but no wind drove it. The world silent. Clouds thin, light low. The man and his son woke slowly. He thanked Ellen, voice rough. He insisted he would return home to assess damage. She told him to wait until midday when paths cleared more. He agreed and sat again. Thomas woke and smiled when he saw new company. He shared what little bread remained. Ellen handed the man a cloth sack of crate slats for temporary heat. She walked him to the street. Snow reached her knees, but easy enough to step through now that wind gone. He walked south with his boy beside him. Snow swallowed their tracks quickly as they moved. Ellen returned home. The stove held warmth. The house felt safe again, but she knew winter rarely paused long. After breakfast, she checked windows again. The quilt strips held firm. She packed a fresh bundle of supplies for another trip to the ridge. Thomas watched, eyes wide with concern. She told him whether gentler now, though she said nothing about weariness pressing against her bones. She walked to the church first. Volunteers sorted blankets and food into baskets for families affected by chimney damage. The pastor thanked her for quilts from night before. He said they planned to distribute aid to south end of town soon. Eileen offered to deliver some on her way if paths clear. She took a small basket from a table and stepped outside. Snow glittered under new sunlight. The air crisp but still. The ridge stood visible, clear against sky. She looked toward it and breathed slow. Another day of travel waited. She walked, careful but steady, leaving footprints across fresh snow. Ellen stepped into the street with the basket held tight against her coat. The air had a cold bite that touched her eyes and cheeks, but no wind pushed at her back. Even the snowflakes falling now drifted slow, as if tired from the storm. Thomas waved from the window before she turned toward the ridge. Footprints from neighbors crisscrossed the path, each step sinking deep into soft drifts. Ellen followed the clearest line, boots pressing down until snow hugged her ankles. The sound of her steps muffled. The town behind held quiet movement, soft talk, shovels, scraping, distant coughs. People woke to a town changed again. She passed Mrs. Hale's home. Smoke climbed from her chimney in a thin, straight line. Mrs. Hale stood on the porch sweeping snow into piles. Her children wrapped in blankets peered through the doorway. She waved at Ellen and asked if the ridge still held families. Ellen nodded. Mrs. Hale lifted a hand in silent prayer, then stepped inside again. Ellen approached the boarded shop near the edge of town. Broken crates still leaned against walls from last week's delivery. She lifted a few slats to bring to the rail families later if needed. She set them beside a tree to collect after checking conditions ahead. As she walked farther north, houses spaced wider apart. Snow crushed fences in places. One small stable sagged under heavy weight from the roof. A farmer knelt beside it, pushing snow from beams. He nodded at Ellen, sweat freezing at his brow despite the cold. She asked if he needed help. He shook his head and said the storm gave enough trouble to everyone. She wished him strength and continued up the road. The ridge rose steep. Snow packed heavy along its slope where wind curled across the top during the night. Her boots slipped once, sending her knee into the drift. She pushed up again, steadying herself with one hand pressed to the hill. Her breath grew short and quick. At the first flat step, she paused, catching air inside her scarf. She looked down at town. Smoke rose higher now. She could see children throwing snow into a cart, clearing streets for horse paths. A dog barked faintly, then disappeared behind a house. Ellen continued climbing. Her fingers numbed even inside her mittens. She shifted the basket to her other arm and flexed her hands until blood moved again. She reached the ridge peak. The view cut wide. The rail line below stretched straight, now half hidden by deep drifts that swelled like frozen waves. The train's still there, though only the top of the engine roof visible under piled snow. Blankets covered windows like before. No figures outside. Ellen descended the slope slowly. Her boots sank deep. A few spots forced her to use hands and knees. Each touch burned cold. She reached the tracks with legs shaking from effort. A boy near the first car saw her and called to his mother. She stepped out, holding a pot of melted snow, face pale but alert. She smiled at Ellen with a tired relief. Ellen handed her the basket. Inside lay cloth, bread crusts, and a small pouch of dried berries. The woman thanked her, voice cracking from dryness. Lelin asked if the fire held through the night. The woman nodded. They burned crate boards taken from the back of the train. Children stayed close together to hold warmth. Still hard, but no one lost to the freeze. A man stepped from the engine car. Frost clung to his beard. He said a rail worker planned to arrive later with tools to clear wheels. Ellen said she would go back soon to check if help moved along the road. He offered to walk her back halfway, but she told him to save strength. Ellen walked along the line of cars, checking on each family. A woman's newborn swaddled in layers, tiny hands hidden from view. A father brushing frost from his eldest daughter's hair. A pair of brothers carrying snow to melt into water, their eyes wide but focused. She left them the cloth strips. Thomas cut the night before and told them to wrap wrists and ankles tight so heat stayed near blood. They thanked her again and again. Their gratitude warmed more than the stove inside her home. Elin stepped away from the tracks and climbed back toward the ridge. Each step upward harder than descent. She paused often, chest tight from cold air pressing her lungs. Snow pressed heavy against her boots with every lift. Halfway up, a loud crack echoed behind her. She spun around. Snow shifted near the train's far end. A section of drift slid down, burying part of a car's wheel. Ellen held her breath as she watched movement stop. The train stayed firm. No collapse. Relief rushed through her. She reached the top, breathing hard. The sky darker as clouds thickened again. Snow fell faster. She hurried down the other side. Near the bottom she slipped, catching herself with one hand. She brushed snow from her sleeve and checked her basket. The items gone to good hands. She felt lighter. The road back long but familiar now. She followed her own tracks until they faded under fresh snowfall. Stronger wind pushed flakes into swirling shapes. She lowered her head and moved with purpose. Near the mill, the man she helped through the night waved to her from his repaired doorway. His wife stood beside him, holding a pot above a fire pit outside. They smiled at Ellen despite tired eyes. She waved back, then continued home. Thomas met her at the door, cheeks flushed with indoor warmth. He held her sleeve and asked if the train people safe. She knelt so her eyes met his, and she told him the family's warm again. He nodded, pleased. Inside, heat from the stove still strong. Mrs. Hale left a small basket of carrots near the table. Ellen washed them and cut them into a pot of broth. Thomas brought 2 slices of bread from their shelf. They ate, feeling comfort rise through their bodies. Afterward, Ellen helped Thomas put on his coat. They stepped outside to help clear snow from their roof. She climbed a small ladder, pushing snow with a flat board. Thomas gathered fallen clumps and carried them to a pile near the fence. The work slow but kept them warm. Neighbors worked too. A man hammered his door frame to strengthen hinges. A woman shook blankets near her porch. Snow fell more gently now, as if storm tired. When roofs safe, Elin returned inside. Thomas followed, laughing faintly from exertion. Night approached again, though earlier than she wanted. She fed peat into the stove, then wood from the crate pile. The room warmed enough for Thomas to sit near the window without shivering. Ellen sat at the table, rubbing warmth back into her fingers. She thought of the train families, the weight of snow on the ridge, and the message the rail worker gave. Hope felt present, but not strong enough to trust yet. Thomas crawled into bed, pulling quilts to his chin. Ellen tucked him in and placed the warm bricks near his feet. He whispered that she saved many people. She shook her head gently and said winter forced everyone to watch for each other. He smiled and closed his eyes. Ellen returned to the stove. She knelt and checked the fire. It burned steady, its glow soft across the walls. She sat beside it, listening to the hush outside. Snow still fell, but nothing threatened tonight. She leaned her head against the wall and allowed her eyes to close for a moment. Rest came quiet, not deep, but enough. Morning waited with work again. Ellen woke to grey light slipping through thin frost on the window. The storm weakened through the night, leaving a heavy stillness in the air. She rubbed her hands together before moving, her joints stiff from climbing the ridge and handling wood through long, cold hours. Thomas still slept, cheeks red from warmth trapped beneath blankets. Ellen rose and crossed to the stove. She opened the grate and found embers still alive beneath a layer of ash. She added thin strips from the crate pile, then peat. The fire caught after a few slow breaths. Heat spread through the room, soft but steady. Thomas stirred and sat up with a sleepy smile. He asked if they would visit the square today. Ellen nodded. She said the mayor planned to speak near the church about coal and stalled shipments. Thomas pulled on his shoes fast, ready to leave before breakfast. Ellen handed him bread soaked in broth and told him to eat slow. She wrapped her scarf around her neck and stepped outside. The air heavy but calm. Snow reached her knees in places where wind pushed drifts overnight. Thomas followed close, holding her coat sleeve. They walked the street toward the town center. People gathered near the church steps, some wrapped in heavy coats, others in layered shirts and patched quilts. Children sat on crates, feet swinging above snow. The bell above the church hung still, thick frost coating its sides. The mayor stood on the steps with the pastor beside him, his breath short as he spoke. He said the train east remained stuck. No coal would arrive until workers cleared tracks. The mill burned through reserves during the last storm. Most houses survived with wood, peat, and scraps from broken crates. He asked for patience. He asked people to share what they held. Murmurs spread. A man near the front shook his head, saying his family almost froze. A woman said her chimney cracked. Another asked if horses sent to the ridge returned. Each question filled the space with tension. Ellen stood among them, holding Thomas's hand. She spotted the rail worker from days before, standing beside the fence. He said crews planned another attempt at clearing tracks by nightfall. They waited for metal tools to thaw by the engine. Ellen asked if he needed help carrying supplies to the ridge. He looked surprised that a young girl offered, but he nodded slow. The mayor finished speaking and people dispersed, some grumbling, others silent. Ellen walked Thomas to the church kitchen where volunteers handed out warm porridge. She filled a small bowl for him, then sat on a bench while he ate. Mrs. Hale approached with her children and sat across from them. She said the roof held through the storm, but the wood pile shrinking fast. Ellen told her to gather branches near the southern lots where fences collapsed. Mrs. Hale sighed with relief and thanked her. After breakfast, Ellen walked to the store for more cloth strips. The owner said traders sold their last rolls 2 days earlier. He offered a smaller bundle at reduced price. Ellen bought it with 3 coins, leaving her pockets nearly empty. She folded the cloth into her coat, planning to cut them into smaller pieces later. Thomas followed her back home. She lit a candle near the table and worked with scissors, cutting long strips to wrap hands and ankles for Ridge families. She set them aside in a neat pile. By midday, the rail worker knocked on her door. He held a bundle of metal tools wrapped in canvas. He said the crew needed rope and spare wood near the ridge to brace wheels before clearing ice. He asked her to carry smaller tools in her basket. Ellen agreed, though she asked him to walk ahead and check if the path safe after the storm. He nodded and left, boots crunching across fresh snow. Ellen packed her basket again. Cloth strips, wood slats, 2 tin cups, a small bundle of oats, and half a candle. She told Thomas to stay with Mrs. Hale until her return. He hugged her tight before letting go. She walked the northern road alone. Snow deeper near the first hill. She lifted her legs high to break drifts. The sky dimmed, though still midday. The sun hid behind grey sheets of cloud. Her breath left white trails. She reached the hill base in good time. The climb harder than before. Snow softened on the surface, but packed firm beneath. Each step sank half a foot. She paused often, breathing slow to save strength. Wind returned in short bursts, cutting across her face. She pulled her scarf higher and leaned forward. At the ridge top, the rail worker waited near a tree. He pointed toward the valley. Several workers already below, digging around the train wheels with metal bars. Ellen descended carefully, helping clear loose snow with her hands. Cold stung through her gloves, but she worked without pause. They packed wood beneath each wheel to lift metal from ice. Then they chipped frost from hinges. Each strike echoed through the valley. Children peeked from windows inside the cars, watching silently. Ellen handed cloth strips to a mother who wrapped her infant tighter. She gave oats to a man alone near the last car. He bowed his head with quiet thanks. A worker shouted from the engine. The thawed valve released a puff of steam. The engine groaned, as if waking from long sleep. The sound drew families closer. Their eyes followed every movement. The crew tried to move the train 1 foot. The wheels turned, but slipped. Snow held firm. Workers placed more wood under wheels to gain traction. Ellen helped carry boards until her arms shook. After hours of effort, the engine moved an inch, then 2, then forward a full length of wood. The shift small, but enough to break some ice that held the car still. Workers cheered softly, half from relief, half from exhaustion. Light faded. The ridge darkened. Snow still fell, though slower. The crew agreed to stop for the night. They needed rest before pushing again tomorrow. They escorted families back inside their cars and secured blankets over doors. Ellen walked back up the ridge with the rail worker, their breaths heavy. Neither spoke much. At the top, he stopped and thanked her. He said, without her help, families might have slept without fire again. She lowered her gaze and nodded. Night settled hard. Snowflakes drifted like ash in quiet air. Ellen walked toward town, legs slow and heavy. Thomas waited inside the door of Mrs. Hale's house, half asleep. When he saw Ellen, he smiled weakly and reached for her hand. She walked him home and settled him into bed. She sat by the stove, warming her hands. The fire burned strong. She looked toward the window where frost patterned along the corners. The night held silence, but not fear. The coal did not arrive, but people moved. Fires stayed lit. The train shifted. Small steps, yet enough to keep hope breathing. Ellen slept in short stretches through the night, waking to check the stove every hour. The fire kept a steady glow, though the stack shrank fast. Thomas slept curled tight beneath quilts, only his hair visible. When dawn arrived, it came through the window as a dull grey light that touched the room without warmth. She rose slowly, joints stiff from yesterday's climb. Her shoulders ached from carrying boards and cloth. She rubbed her palms together to stir blood through her fingers, then opened the stove door to add more wood. Thomas woke soon after. He asked if the train moved farther. She shook her head. He said, maybe today. She smiled faint at his hope. They ate a thin breakfast of broth and carrots. No bread left. Ellen planned to return to the store once streets cleared. She wrapped her scarf and stepped outside to check the path. Snow rose high across the yard, pressing against their doorframe. She pulled hard to open it, but the door barely moved. Drifts held it tight. She braced her boot against the floor and pushed again. The wood groaned. Snow compressed but did not shift enough to let her step out. Thomas helped push from behind. Together they forced the door open by inches until a gap formed wide enough for her to slip outside. Snow spilled into the house as she cleared the frame with her arm, outside. The world lay silent beneath smooth hills of white. Doors across the street shut tight beneath heavy drifts. Some houses looked buried halfway. Chimneys sent thin smoke into still air. No sound of carts or shovels yet. She grabbed a wooden board and began clearing snow from their doorway. Thomas handed her smaller chunks to toss aside. The work took longer than expected, the snow heavy and wet from settling during the night. When their door finally opened without resistance, she moved on to the nearest neighbor. Mrs. Hale's door stuck worse. Snow packed high up to the window. Ellen knocked on the side wall and called through the frame. Mrs. Hale answered from inside with muffled voice. She said she tried to open it since first light, but it would not move. Ellen shoveled around the door until hinges loosened. Mrs. Hale stepped out with gratitude. Holding her youngest child wrapped in blankets, Ellen continued down the street, clearing paths for others. Each door held its own weight. Some required shoving from both sides. One house stayed silent. Ellen knocked twice. No answer. She pushed snow away and opened the door slightly. A quiet family sat inside, wrapped in shawls, stove cold. Their chimney clogged during the storm. They tried to fix it through the night, but gave up when smoke filled the room. Elin told them to move near her house until repairs finished. They packed quickly and followed her through the path she carved. She gave them quilts and placed them near the stove. Thomas poured broth into small cups for their children. Their father stepped outside to clear his chimney once he warmed enough to hold tools steady by midday. Streets filled with people clearing snow. Shovels scraped through thick crust. Children hauled chunks into piles for sleds later. A group of men pulled branches from a broken fence to use as fuel. The mill doors opened, but only a handful of workers entered. The rest stayed home to repair roofs or help neighbors. Lelin met Mrs. Hale near the square again. They each carried tools to help break ice from a frozen pump. Water trickled slow once cleared. Families lined up to fill small buckets. Near the church steps, the pastor spoke with the mayor. Both looked tired. The mayor asked volunteers to spread heat bricks across homes where elderly struggled to move. Ellen offered to run the route with Thomas, though she told him to stay wrapped warm. They carried bricks from the kitchen furnace and delivered them through town. At each home, grateful faces met them with hushed thanks. As dusk approached, Ellen decided to check the ridge again. She told Thomas to stay with Mrs. Hale, who agreed. He hugged her tightly, uncomfortable letting her go alone. She promised to return before moonlight. She walked toward the north road again. Snow thicker near the edge of town, where drifts piled without fences to break wind. The climb slower this time, each step heavy. Her breath burned cold in her chest. The sun dipped behind hills when she reached the ridge peak. Below, lanterns flickered along the train cars. Workers surrounded the engine. Tools struck metal. Voices low but focused. She descended carefully, legs trembling from fatigue. A man waved her over. He said progress good through the day. Wheels lifted higher. They planned to move the train at sunrise. Ellen passed cloth strips to mothers and gave a small tin of broth powder to the eldest woman in the last car. She checked on the newborn again. The child slept, cheeks warm beneath layers. The wind grew stronger as night settled. Workers packed tools to leave. Ellen walked with them up the ridge. A few carried lanterns while others used sticks to steady footing. Snow clouds gathered overhead again at the top. The rail worker stopped beside Ellen. He said, once tracks cleared, the train might leave straight through without stopping. He asked if she wanted to send letters or names for passengers to carry east. She lowered her gaze, thinking of her father. She said she had nothing to send yet but would think. They parted midway down the path. Ellen walked alone toward town. The wind louder now, though still steady, not violent like the last storm. She wrapped her scarf tighter. Lights from townhouses glowed in soft amber through windows. Smoke drifted upward in thin trails. She reached Mrs. Hale's home first. Thomas sat near the fire, half asleep. When he saw Ellen, he stood fast and grabbed her hand. They walked home. The door opened without trouble now. The stove still warm. Ellen placed Thomas in bed and pulled quilts to his chin. She added bricks under covers to keep heat longer. She sat beside the window and watched night settle. Snowflakes fell quiet. Roofs leaned under weight but held. The street still. No shouting, no panic. Only soft steps of neighbors walking home. Ellen rested her head against the wall. She listened to the stove crackle. Her body heavy, but mind steady. Tomorrow the train might move. If it left, supplies would reach towns ahead. Coal might return, but she wondered what silence would settle once the valley emptied again. She closed her eyes and let the night stay quiet. Ellen woke before dawn, not to cold or creaking wood, but to unfamiliar silence. No wind tapped the walls. No roof shifted. The house held still beneath a soft layer of night air. She sat up slow, careful not to wake Thomas. The stove burned low, but still warm. She fed small slats into the embers until flame rose. She wrapped her coat and stepped outside with a bucket to gather snow for water. The sky held faint blue behind the hills. Snow lay smooth across the street, untouched since late night. Her boots left sharp prints. A dog barked somewhere near the mill, then fell quiet. Thomas stepped outside soon after, rubbing his eyes. He stayed close to her side as they walked toward the square to check if the mayor posted new notices. Other families gathered near the frozen pump. Workers cleared paths with shovels and ropes. Horses stood tethered near the church, steam rising from their backs. Their owners checked harness straps, preparing for travel once the train moved. The mayor spoke to the rail worker beside the church steps. Ellen approached in time to hear east tracks nearly cleared. The final stretch still deep with ice packed hard under wheels. They planned to make the last effort with more wood braces and iron bars once the sun rose higher. If movement good, the train would leave before dusk. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some people lifted shoulders, relieved that travel might resume. Others looked worried, unsure if help would reach them before supplies drained. One woman asked if any coal left in town reserves. The mayor shook his head. A few frowned, frustrated but tired of arguing. Ellen knelt beside Thomas to tie his scarf tighter. She told him they would head to the ridge again. He asked to join. She paused. His legs short, the climb hard. He insisted with quiet determination. She decided to bring him part way and let him wait near the first slope where wind less harsh. He nodded and followed. They walked north with a steady pace. Snow firmer than yesterday, packed from shovels and footsteps. They reached the base of the ridge before sunrise fully broke the horizon. Lanterns already flickered at the top. Workers moved ahead. Ellen helped Thomas sit on a fallen branch near a fence. She wrapped a quilt around his shoulders. She told him to stay until she returned. He agreed, though he watched her without blinking until she began climbing. The ridge climbed slower today, her legs heavy from many trips. She planted each step with care. Frost crusted along the slope where wind brushed loose snow overnight. Her hands cold even inside mittens. She pushed forward at the top. Steam rose from the engine again. Workers struck ice along the rails with iron bars, sparks flying where metal met stone. Others fed wood beneath wheels while two men shoveled snow around the far corner. Ellen descended to help. She carried wood from a stack they built yesterday. The man with frost in his beard nodded at her arrival. He told her wheels lifted another inch before dawn. Progress small but sure. She worked among them, breath short, arms aching. Families inside the cars packed their blankets and bags, unsure if the train would leave or return. Some children leaned against windows watching snow fall. A few pressed hands to glass when Ellen passed. Around midday, the engine hissed louder. Steam spilled across the track. The engineer shouted for clearance. Workers stepped aside. The engine strained forward. Snow crunched under wheels. The train lurched, moved a foot, then stopped again. The crew adjusted wood braces and tried a second time. The engine pushed harder. Wheels turned. Snow broke away. The front car advanced past a tree stump that held it in place through the storm. Cheers rose across the valley. Elin climbed the ridge, a few steps to see farther. Down the slope and beyond open field, figures appeared along the horizon. Not villagers, riders. 3 horses pulled a wagon loaded high with sacks. Smoke trailed from the wagon's lanterns. The riders moved slow, tired but steady. Workers near Ellen noticed too. One asked if those from Eastern Rail Yard. Another said supply hunters. The train crew paused efforts, watching silhouettes grow clearer. Ellen walked a few yards down the ridge with a lantern. The riders grew closer. Snow clung to their coats. Their horses staggered from fatigue. The wagon wheels rough with frost. The lead rider lifted a hand but kept head low. When they reached the ridge base, Ellen recognized the face of one rider from the weekly market months earlier. He stepped from the wagon, boots sinking deep. He said they left 3 nights ago, hauling leftover coal from a collapsed depot farther east. The journey slow because storms blocked paths and horses tired. He pointed into the wagon where sacks lay stacked in uneven piles. Ellen stepped closer and saw black fragments inside loose burlap, enough to heat dozens of homes for days, enough to feed the mill's furnace for short shifts, enough to boil water without fear of using last stick of wood. She signaled workers on the ridge. They shouted for others to help unload. Men and women hurried down to assist. They formed a line across snow, passing sacks from hand to hand. Ellen felt the weight in her arms, heavier than she expected. She placed each sack near the base of the ridge, creating a tall stack. Thomas saw movement from his seat near the fence and ran toward them. He gasped when he saw coal piled high. He smiled wide, swirling flakes from his hair. With coal secured, the riders rested beside the wagon. One horse collapsed to its knees from exhaustion. Ellen knelt beside it, brushing snow from its neck. She whispered quiet thanks, though no one heard. Workers returned to the train. With coal available in town, urgency shifted. They still planned to move the train, but no longer pressed into night. The engineer said they would wait until sunrise, when rails thawed more in new light. Ellen packed loose cloth in her basket and offered pieces to the riders for warmth. They accepted with tired nods. Snow cleared again near dusk, revealing long shadow across the valley. Lanterns lit along the ridge path like small stars. Families in the train began eating small meals from supplies shared across the line. Ellen gathered Thomas and walked back toward town with others. The path harder to see in fading light, but footsteps clear enough. People whispered to one another about coal, relief passing between them like breath. They reached town after nightfall. Fires burned brighter in chimneys. Windows glowed in soft orange. Voices carried from homes, quiet but no longer strained. Ellen brought 2 sacks to Mrs. Hale's doorstep. She left them without knocking. Mrs. Hale noticed and shouted a grateful call through the window. Ellen smiled and moved on. She returned home and dropped a sack near the stove. She tore open the top and set 2 lumps inside the grate. The fire flared strong, spreading deep warmth across the room. Thomas sat near the stove and held his hands out with long sighs. Ellen finally sat. Her legs trembled from long hours of climbing and carrying. She let warmth sink into her body. Thomas leaned against her shoulder. Breathing slow outside, snow fell again. Gentle this time. Coal arrived, not by train, but by hands that refused to stop moving through miles of frozen road. The town held life. Again, coal burned through the night with a steady glow that reached the far corners of the house. Ellen slept deeper than she had in weeks, though not long. Before dawn, she woke to the faint crackling of embers and the soft sound of Thomas shifting under quilts. No wind pressed the walls. No roof groaned. A stillness settled that felt earned, not forced. She rose and stirred the coals with an iron hook, adding 2 smaller lumps from the sack. Heat rose slow but strong. She warmed her hands above the grate, letting strength return to her fingers before stepping outside. The door opened without struggle. Snow lighter today, only a thin layer on the porch. The sky pale grey with streaks of soft blue near the horizon. She walked to the pump and filled 2 buckets. Water flowed easier than yesterday since others cleared ice late into the evening. Steps echoed faint across frozen ground as families emerged from their homes, each carrying pails, crates, or baskets. Thomas joined her outside, rubbing his eyes. He lifted a bucket too heavy to hold, so she handed him a smaller tin cup instead. Together they walked toward the square. Smoke rose from chimneys across town, thick and warm, not desperate this time. Doors opened. People breathed slower. The mayor stood near the church with a ledger under his arm. He spoke to a small group about dividing coal. Each household would take a small share. Enough until the train moved. Enough until more shipments arrived. No one argued. The coal had not come by authority. It arrived through effort and frost-bitten riders. People understood its weight. Ellen stepped forward and offered to carry sacks to elderly homes. The mayor agreed. He handed her a list. Names she recognized. Some she did not. Thomas offered to help, so she held the smaller sacks and let him carry cloth and matches. They moved house to house through slow morning light. The first home belonged to an old tailor. His hands shook when he took the coal. He asked if Ellen remembered when she first came to his shop with her mother years before. She nodded but stayed quiet. He touched the sack gently, as if grateful without words. Next, they visited a widow with frost on her window frames. She sat wrapped in shawls near an unlit stove. Ellen knelt to place 2 lumps into the grate and struck a match. Flame rose slow. The widow whispered that warmth sounded like breathing again. Ellen stayed long enough to watch her shift closer to heat before leaving. They continued across town. Each door opened with cautious hope. Some families saved coal for night. Others heated pots and boiled thin broth. Children pressed their faces near the stove to feel heat on their cheeks. By midday, Ellen returned home briefly to rest. She drank warm water with a pinch of salt to steady her legs. Thomas ate carrots dipped in broth. They sat in quiet comfort, listening to the stove hum. Elin thought about the ridge. The train still stuck, but close to freedom. She decided to go again. Thomas watched her lace her boots. He asked if the train leaving meant they would not need to visit anymore. She said she did not know. He nodded slow, unsure what that meant. She walked north alone. Snow thinner than yesterday but deep enough to slow her pace. Tracks visible now from constant foot traffic. She reached the base of the ridge and saw lanterns gleaming along the slope. Workers moved tools. Voices rose with energy she had not heard in days. She climbed, each step easier than before. At the top she paused to breathe slowly, then descended to the valley. The train sat farther forward, almost clear of the deepest drift. The engine puffed white steam, more lively than ever. Mothers gathered near the first car, preparing their children to board again. Some packed bags. Some brushed snow from sleeves. A few hesitated, unsure if leaving safe. Ellen walked toward the engine. The rail worker she knew from the first day stood beside it, leaning on a shovel. He said slow progress all morning. They planned a final push when sun reached its highest point. He pointed to the far track, where ice still clung hard beneath a fallen branch. Workers chopped through it with axes. Eli offered help. He directed her to carry wood supports to the other side of the cars. She spent the next hour lifting planks, pressing them under wheels, steadying braces, and handing tools to men with frozen hands. Children inside watched her again, their eyes wide with something between admiration and fear. She smiled at them, then moved on. By afternoon, the sun reached its peak. The engineer climbed into the engine cab. Workers stepped aside. Steam grew louder. The wheels turned slow. The train shuddered. Metal groaned across snow. Then it moved, one car length. Then another. People cheered. Families hugged each other. The valley echoed with the sound of movement after days trapped. Ellen stepped back, letting joy wash through her. She watched the wheels lift free of hardened ice. She felt the cold air stir around her, light and restless. But then the train stopped again. Not stuck, waiting. The rail worker approached her. He said they held until everyone ready. Some families preferred to stay and settle in town until spring roads safer. Others wanted to leave, the decision heavy. Ellen did not speak for a moment. She thought of her father far along the rail lines, perhaps waiting for work to resume. She thought of her mother alone at the boarding kitchen each morning before dawn. She felt the stretch of distance between all things. Snow began falling again, thin and sharp. The engineer signaled. Workers cleared final ice. The families boarded slowly. Some waved to townsfolk. Others cried into scarves. Ellen stood near the ridge with hands folded. She wanted to say something, but no words formed. The engine whistled short. Wheels rolled. The train pulled forward, slow at first, then steady into the wide snowfield beyond the valley. Tracks cut a dark line through pale earth. Smoke trailed behind in soft grey streaks. Ellen watched until it vanished beyond the trees. Silence filled the space again. But no weight pressed her chest. The silence different now, not born from need or fear, born from movement completed. She turned and walked back to town with steady steps. Snowflakes clung to her coat, the ridge path familiar, no longer daunting. Thomas waited outside Mrs. Hale's home. When he saw her, he ran through snow and wrapped his arms around her waist. She held him as long as he needed. They walked home together. Inside, the fire glowed bright. She set her boots near the wall and sat close to the stove. Thomas rested beside her, dropping his head onto her arm, outside. Snow continued falling. The town breathed. Ellen woke before sunrise again, though for the first time in many days she did not rise out of urgency. Her body moved slow, her mind quiet. Thomas slept with his arms wrapped around a quilt, his breath soft and steady. The stove still held warmth from the coal they burned through the night. Ellen added to small lumps, enough to keep the room warm until morning settled fully. She stepped outside to check the street. The snow carried shallow footprints from neighbors who moved early. A man hauled a barrel toward the mill. 2 women cleared their porch steps. Smoke drifted from chimneys, dense and comforting. The world looked softer without the train resting in the valley. The ridge felt distant, no longer pulling her forward with need. Thomas joined her, rubbing frost from his hair. He asked what they would do now that the train left. She said they would rest, then fix things winter damaged. He nodded, though his expression unsure. For days their lives filled with purpose. Now stillness returned, and stillness carried its own weight. They walked to the square. People gathered along the street, some speaking quietly about new deliveries and hoped for letters. Others carried sacks of coal from last night's share, careful not to spill any. The mayor stood with the pastor beside the church steps, writing names on a fresh page. Ellen approached. The mayor thanked her and the children who helped these past days. He said people talked about her work in the ridge. She shook her head, not wanting attention. The pastor placed a gloved hand on her shoulder and said, "Sometimes help, done in silence, holds deeper value." She stayed quiet. Thomas pulled her coat gently and asked to visit Mrs. Hale. They walked to her home, snow crunching beneath their boots. Mrs. Hale greeted them with a smile worn from fatigue. She invited them inside, though the house already full of neighbors seeking warmth. Ellen stepped back and said they would return later. She and Thomas returned outside to clear more snow from roofs along the street. Some structures weighed heavy from frozen slush that thickened under night frost. Ellen climbed ladders with a flat board while Thomas pushed fallen snow into piles. They worked until their arms ached. Later, they rested beside the pump. Ellen brushed snow from her sleeves. Thomas sat beside her, swinging his legs. The sun crept low even though afternoon had not ended. Winter days shorter than memory. As they sat, an old man approached. His beard long, coat patched with mismatched cloth. He carried an empty bucket and moved slow. Ellen stood and offered to fill it for him. He nodded and lowered himself onto a bench while she worked. When she brought the bucket back, he thanked her with tired breath. He said his house lost heat weeks ago. He burned chair legs and shelf boards to stay warm. The coal shared last night saved him from moving into the church hall. He asked how she knew to help so many. Ellen said she watched the town and carried what she saw others needed. He nodded, eyes soft, and said winter always showed which people the season trusted. Elin left him with an extra cloth strip for his hands. He wrapped it around his wrist and walked away slow. As dusk approached, the sky dimmed early again. People carried lanterns sooner than expected. Workers near the mill closed doors to keep heat inside. Children ran across snow, throwing handfuls upward like scattering dust. Ellen walked home with Thomas. They lit 2 candles on the table and warmed water in a kettle. Thomas drank slow, warming his hands around the cup. Ellen rested beside the stove, boots still on, legs stretched out. She watched steam rise from the kettle and fade into shadows. Later, she stepped outside again, alone. The town quiet now. Houses glowed from within. Thick snow-draped fences and roofs. The ridge faint in the distance, a soft shape against deeper sky. She walked without hurry, letting the road guide her legs. She passed the mill, its windows dark but safe. She passed the boarded shop where crates once stood broken. She walked toward the old rail line that cut behind town, where a smaller path led to the frozen river. She reached the riverbanks and stood near the edge. Ice thick as stone. The surface smooth, no cracks visible. She knelt to touch its edge. Cold pressed through her glove. Sharp but grounding. The river once carried logs and small boats, long before storms closed trade routes. Ellen looked across and remembered hearing men say, water here froze deeper than most winters in 1906. She wondered if spring would break it all in one loud snap, or in slow pieces across many days. A lantern approached from the far path. She stood and watched as Mrs. Hale's husband stepped into view, carrying wood under his arm. He nodded at her and said he headed to the widow's home to patch her chimney before night grew colder. Ellen offered to help. He shook his head gently and said she did enough for the night. She stepped back to let him pass. She walked farther along the river, boots marking new prints in untouched snow. The silence here thicker, trees bent under frost. No birds, no water beneath, no sound except her breath. She sat on a fallen log and lowered her hood. Wind barely moved. She closed her eyes, letting the quiet settle the space inside her that worked without rest since the storm. For a long time, she did not move. When she finally stood, night held the town in a soft grip, stars faint behind cloud haze. She walked home slow, unhurried. Thomas slept when she arrived. She tucked him in deeper, placed warm bricks near his feet, and sat beside the stove again. Embers glowed orange. The room warm, but her body still carried chill from the riverbank. She laid her hands near the grate and breathed slow. Tomorrow they would gather more wood. Tomorrow they would fix loose boards and clear pathways. Tomorrow the world ordinary again. Her eyes closed gently as the fire settled outside. The snow stopped falling and the town held steady in the quiet. Elin woke to a sharp crack somewhere outside, not loud enough to frighten her, but firm enough to pull her from sleep. The house held steady, warm from coal that burned through the night. Thomas slept curled against her side. She slipped from the quilts without waking him and added thin strips to the embers. The stove flared gently, pushing warmth into the air. She stepped outside with her coat half buttoned. The sky held a pale yellow edge beyond the hills. Snow crusted hard overnight, creating a surface that held her weight without sinking. The crack she heard came from a tree near the fence where ice snapped under morning thaw. It leaned but did not fall. The street looked different. Tracks from sleds and boots crossed in every direction, not hurried like days before, but steady. People walked with purpose instead of worry. Children carried baskets instead of blankets. A few stood near the pump trading stories of the night the coal first burned. Thomas joined her, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He asked why morning quiet felt different. She told him the town no longer waited for survival, only for routine. He listened, though he did not fully understand. They walked to the square. A group of men stood beside the general store, loading a small cart with canvas sacks and folded sacks sealed with twine. The sacks marked with ink letters. A young boy sorted envelopes from a wooden crate. His hands moved careful, not hurried. Ellen moved closer. The mayor joined them, marking names on a new list. He said riders from the east brought letters along with the coal, though most arrived damp or torn. These carried messages from families far from town, some from travelers stuck in other valleys, others from workers on rail lines waiting for rails to open again. Ellen scanned the pile. No letter with her family name. Not Williams. Not Harper. Not Rowan. She looked twice, then stepped back. She told herself she expected nothing since her father travelled often, rarely staying in towns long enough to write. Still, a small ache stirred beneath her coat. Thomas picked up an envelope that had no clear address. Ink smudged, corners burned from sparks. He asked if they should return it. Ellen gave it to the boy sorting mail. He placed it aside to send back with riders once roads clear. The mayor read names aloud, handing letters to villagers as they gathered around. Some cried softly when hearing from loved ones trapped in storms. Others held envelopes tight, waiting to read in private. When the list finished, Ellen stepped forward and offered to walk letters to the far end of town where snow still deep. The mayor agreed, trusting her with the task. He handed her 5 envelopes and a small map of homes. She folded the map and tucked it into her coat. Thomas followed beside her, helping carry to envelopes. They walked past the mill, where smoke rose in thin lines, though the doors stayed shut. Workers scraped frost from gears outside before starting short shifts. Not enough coal yet for full hours. They reached the first home, a stone house with narrow windows. A man answered with red eyes, cheeks stiff from cold. He took the letter with trembling fingers and stepped back inside without speaking. Ellen sensed both fear and relief in his eyes, mixed so tightly she could not separate them. The next home, smaller, with sagging steps and frost along the rail. An elderly woman opened the door. Her hand shook as she recognized the handwriting. She pressed the letter to her chest and invited Ellen and Thomas inside to warm themselves. They stayed only long enough to see her sit near the stove. Whispering a name through cracked lips, they delivered all 5 letters by midday. The last home belonged to a teacher who lost her husband to winters earlier. She opened the door slow, preparing to decline charity, then froze when she saw the envelope. She thanked Ellen and leaned against the frame, closing her eyes as though gathering strength. Ellen stepped away with Thomas. Letting her read in peace, they returned to the square where new talk stirred. Travellers planned to leave town the next morning to bring letters toward the valley where another train stuck. They needed guides familiar with snowpaths. Ellen heard 2 men whisper her name, pointing at her boots and the marks along her coat from climbing the ridge. She ignored them and kept walking. Mrs. Hale called to her from the church steps. She held a basket of warm bread, the first batch since grain shipments halted. She handed Ellen to pieces and ruffled Thomas's hair. She said the bakery opened again at half hours and that people shared enough coal for ovens to heat. Ellen broke her bread in half and gave the larger piece to Thomas. They sat on a bench outside the store to eat, the bread soft, steam rising from the center. Ellen ate slow, letting warmth settle in her empty stomach. After eating, Thomas asked if they would go to the river again. Ellen hesitated. She still felt the quiet from the night before, the heavy stillness of ice stretching across the water. She agreed, though she held no words ready for what waited there. They walked along the back road. Snow flatter here, though deeper near tree roots. The river lay silent under thick ice. Marks from sled runners crossed it in faint tracks. Several children skated in worn shoes, sliding more than gliding. Their laughter light but brief as they stumbled and sat to catch breath. Ellen watched them from the bank. Thomas begged to try. She shook her head at first, but relented when he found a flat board to push along the surface. She kept close, stepping onto the ice only a few feet. The surface solid, but she pressed her heel gently to test its grip. Thomas slid across, arms open for balance, cheeks bright with joy. Elin allowed herself a small smile. The river no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a resting place. As afternoon faded, bells still silent from broken ropes, townsfolk used whistles to call children home. Thomas returned to Ellen's side, breath heavy, scarf slipping off his shoulder. She placed her hand on his head and turned toward home. They walked slower than usual, not from exhaustion, but from calm. Snowflakes drifted soft, light as dust. Houses glowed warm behind windows. People spoke in low voices as they passed, no fear in their tone now, only plans. When they reached their door, Ilin paused before entering. She looked down the road. She expected to see another rider approach, or a wagon stuck in a ditch, or a family lost in the dark. Nothing came. The road empty but safe. Inside, she lit the stove again. Coal hissed as it settled into embers. Thomas wrapped himself in quilts and rested near the wall. Ellen poured warm water into 2 cups and handed one to him. They drank together without speaking. Later, she sat at the table with a scrap of paper and a dull pencil. She wrote her father's name at the top, then paused. She had things to say, but did not know which mattered enough to send. She wrote anyway. She told him winter heavy. She told him trains stuck. She told him riders brought coal. She told him she helped where she could. She told him Thomas stronger now. She told him the town moving again. She folded the page and set it beside the stove to dry. When she finished, she looked toward the window. Snow fell in thin lines. The sky deepened to night. The silence no longer heavy, only present. Tomorrow she would take the letter to the riders. Tomorrow roads would open. Little by little, tonight she rested beside the fire and let warmth hold her still. Ellen rose before the first. Trace of light touched the snow. The stove glowed weakly, though enough heat lingered to keep the room warm. She added to coal lumps and sat beside the grate until she felt her hands loosen in the warmth. Thomas slept curled tight, hair pressed to his forehead. She let him stay wrapped in quilts while she prepared for the road. She gathered her letter from the table, folded clean now that the ink dried. She placed it inside a cloth pouch with a small string. She did not know if her father would reach any town soon enough to find it. She wrote anyway. Outside, the air sharp with early cold. Snow layered in smooth sheets across roofs. The sky held no sun yet, only a pale line across distant hills. She walked toward the square to meet the riders. 4 stood beside their horses, packing sacks of letters and bags of dried food. Their coats patched from long travel. Frost clung to mayonnaise and boots. One horse stomped the ground to warm its legs. The mayor handed each rider a folded map showing winter-safe paths. Ellen approached. The mayor nodded. He asked if she still planned to send her letter. She handed it to the youngest rider, a woman with hair tied in a tight knot beneath a fur cap. The rider tucked the letter beneath her coat and promised to hand it to any station with record books. She warned travel slow. Ellen nodded, aware Thomas arrived moments later, awake now, scarf loose and boots unevenly tied. He asked if they could follow part way. Ellen agreed, though she kept one hand on his shoulder as they walked. The riders led their horses through thick snow toward the east road. Ellen and Thomas followed until the first bend. The riders lifted their hands to signal farewell. The sound of hooves faded slow, swallowed by distance rather than storm. Ellen and Thomas remained on the road a while, watching until the horizon held no motion. Then they walked back home at an unhurried pace. Along the way, small changes revealed themselves. The mill doors fully open. Workers moved lumber to a wagon, preparing to restart a short run. The bakery window opened wider, scent of warm dough drifting into cold air. Children dragging sleds toward the river rather than toward wood piles or broken fences. Ellen breathed steady, feeling a new rhythm settle into the town. An older man called to her from his porch. He held rope in one hand and gestured at his roof. Snow still piled heavy there. She set her basket down and climbed the ladder he held. She pushed snow into neat piles, while Thomas helped carry boards that fell. The man thanked them and promised warm broth later in the week. They continued down the road. Ellen knocked on doors where she helped days before. Families answered with clearer eyes, less strain in their voices. Some said they planned to travel once roads safer. Others said they would stay until spring thaw. The decisions spoke to the same future in different ways. Near noon, Ellen walked toward the river again. The ice held strong though. New lines appeared where temperature shifted. Children played farther upstream where water shallow beneath. She stood at the bank watching them with a calmness she did not feel during earlier storms. Thomas joined them, using a worn board again. Ellen watched from the shore, arms crossed loosely. She looked across the frozen stretch, remembering the first night she walked here alone, silence heavy enough to press against her ribs. Today the silence felt open, not thick. She sat on the same fallen log. Snow cleared from its surface by earlier footprints. She touched her scarf where frost clung. She closed her eyes and let the still air fill her thoughts. Voices interrupted her rest. 2 workers from the mill approached carrying metal pipes wrapped in cloth. They asked if she knew where old rail ties stored. She pointed toward an abandoned shed near the south lot. They thanked her and moved on. She stood and walked back to collect Thomas, his cheeks red from play, his coat wet from snow. She led him home by hand. Inside, the house warmer now than any day since storms began. The coal sack half empty, enough to last days if used slow. Enough until the next cart arrived. Ellen prepared thin soup with carrots and a piece of dried onion. Thomas hummed while stirring his cup. They ate at the table, listening to the quiet. After lunch, Ellen took inventory of wood again. She stacked pieces near the stove, sorted by size. She found 3 broken boards from an old crate and set them aside for neighbors. She tied cloth strips together to form rope for winter repairs. Thomas fetched snow in buckets to melt for washing. Ellen scrubbed their coats and gloves, removing dirt from the ridge paths. The water cold, but manageable with heat from the stove. She hung each piece near the hearth to dry. Toward late afternoon, knocks echoed against their door. Ellen opened it. A mother from the train stood outside, holding her newborn wrapped in clean cloth. She said they remained in town instead of traveling further. Her husband joined mill work for short shifts. She wanted to thank Ellen before settling in. Ellen invited her inside, offering warm water. They spoke in low voices, while Thomas entertained the baby with quiet gestures. Before leaving, the woman gave Ellen a piece of dried apple wrapped in cloth. Ellen accepted with quiet appreciation, knowing how rare such food now. When evening arrived, people gathered in the square, not for warnings or shortages, but for a calm meeting. The pastor read names of families who needed additional help. Volunteers stepped forward without hesitation. No panic, only steady action. Ellen and Thomas returned home in twilight. Snow held a faint glow under early moonlight. The house looked smaller now, that weight of storms gone, but still firm and welcoming. Inside, Ellen placed bricks near the stove to heat for night. Thomas crawled under quilts, already drifting to sleep before Ellen tucked him in. She sat by the window, watching lanterns pass outside. People walked with slower steps now, as if grateful that roads learned to be roads again. She let her thoughts settle. She wondered where her father travelled now. She wondered if her letter reached him in time. She wondered if spring would bring new storms or peace. The snow outside shifted under moonlight. Roofs held steady. The wind stayed mild. Ellen breathed slow and let the day end without worry. Ellen woke late the next morning, light already pressing through thin curtains. The room warmer than she expected. Thomas lay sprawled across both quilts, his arms wide, breathing deep. She sat upright slowly, listening. The stove still held heat. The bricks she warmed last night gave off a lingering softness beneath the blankets. She stepped outside to sweep the steps. Snow fell lightly, thin enough to see footprints beneath. A faint scent of bread drifted through the air. The bakery chimney smoked early. Workers at the mill hammered boards onto a wagon frame. The sound small, rhythmic, not rushed. Thomas joined her, jacket half buttoned. He asked what they would do today. She paused, unsure. For many days they acted out of need, not choice. Now winter no longer pushed them with the same force. She told him they would help at the square and see where work waited. They walked toward town centre. The mayor stood beside a table with lists of supplies. Volunteers filled sacks with wood for families too weak to collect it. Ellen moved to help without speaking. She lifted bundles and sorted them by size. Thomas helped tie rope around stacks to carry on sleds. People greeted them with quiet appreciation rather than urgency. An old man handed them dried beans as thanks. A woman pressed wool scraps into Ellen's hands for mending coats. Ellen thanked them both and continued working. Midday passed with steady tasks. Snow never stopped, but never grew heavy. It fell thin, gathering in soft layers rather than deep drifts. Children played along the street with wooden wheels and sticks, laughter echoing along doors no longer shut tight. Ellen heard her name from behind. Mrs. Hale approached with her husband. They asked if Ellen might bring wood to homes farther uphill where steps steep and hard to climb. Ellen nodded. Thomas fetched their sled. They pulled the sled along narrow paths, snow thick in shaded areas, wind sharper near ridge-facing homes. At each house, people greeted them with warmth in their voices, inviting them inside. Ellen declined most invites so she could reach every home before dusk, though she paused long enough to check stoves and window cracks. One home belonged to a miner whose leg broken last month. He thanked Ellen through clenched teeth, grateful yet restless. He said he once walked those roads without help. Ellen knelt to stuff cloth into gaps beneath his door. He watched, silent for a while, then whispered that winter humbled anyone who thought themselves strong. She rose without reply, though his words followed her down the path. The last home sat at the edge of town where the forest began. A narrow fence half buried in snow. A thin plume of smoke drifted from the chimney. Ellen knocked gently. A young widow answered, holding a child who slept on her shoulder. Ellen placed wood near the door and said nothing more. The widow pressed her forehead to the doorframe, unable to speak through relief. Ellen stepped back to give her space. By the time they finished deliveries, the sky turned purple with early dusk. Thomas shivered, cheeks red, scarf wet. Ellen pulled him close as they walked home. Snow fell heavier now, though still soft. Inside, she warmed broth with the dried beans from earlier. She added small bits of carrots saved from a jar. The broth thin but warm. Thomas drank his quickly, hands wrapped around the cup. Ellen placed their boots near the stove to dry. She checked the coal sack. Less than she wished, though enough for a few nights. She saved larger pieces for later, and used thin strips first. Night gathered outside the windows, darker than previous evenings. Clouds thickened, blocking moonlight. Ellen lit 2 candles and placed them on opposite sides of the room. The glow soft, warming edges rather than brightening center. Thomas slept early. Ellen sat awake, watching shadows shift across walls. Thoughts drifted to riders who left at dawn. She pictured the woman carrying her letter across valleys and frozen bridges, stopping at stations barely heated. She wondered how long paths stayed open. A knock broke her stillness. She rose slowly and opened the door. A man she did not know stood outside holding a lantern at his chest. His coat lined with fur, boots covered in frost. He introduced himself as a traveler passing through. His horse injured on river ice. He asked for help finding shelter. Ellen stepped aside and guided him to the church hall where families rested when storms peaked. She walked with him through the snow, lantern light cutting a small circle in the air. He spoke in short sentences, voice tired. He had traveled from the west, moving between towns that lost coal shipments earlier than hers. He said some towns still waited. When they reached the hall, the pastor welcomed him and prepared a cot. Ellen watched the traveler lower himself slowly, shoulders slumped with relief. She left without asking questions. His story belonged to him for now. Outside, snow grew heavier. The wind picked up and pressed against her coat. She walked home faster, boots sinking deep. The street empty of people now. Houses locked tight. Lanterns extinguished to save fuel. Inside, she stirred the embers and placed 2 larger pieces of coal into the stove. Flames rose higher, lighting the room in gentle waves. She pulled quilts across the floor and lay beside Thomas to sleep. Hours later, she woke again. Not from cold. From silence, the wind stopped. Snow fell lighter. The stove held warmth stronger than ever. The house felt still yet alive. She walked through the window. Outside, many houses glowed with faint light. Fires stayed lit through the night for the first time in weeks. Smoke rose in soft trails without desperate cracks of frozen wood. She stood long at the glass, watching the town rest without fear. She returned to her place beside Thomas and closed her eyes. The warmth no longer felt borrowed. It felt earned through steady hands and steady days. Outside, winter breathed slower, holding the town in a gentler grip. Ellen woke before dawn, though she stayed under quilts longer than usual. The house held steady warmth from the fire she fed twice in the night. Thomas slept near her feet, curled into his blanket, with one hand resting on a heated brick. She watched him for a moment, noticing how his breath no longer shook from cold. She rose quietly and added small pieces of wood to the stove. The flames stirred without struggle. Thin smoke drifted up the chimney. Outside, the sky held a grey tone that hinted at morning but still belonged to night. Snow no longer fell. The air still and calm. She stepped outside and stood at the door. Frost clung to railings in thin lines. Roofs shone under early light like layers of crushed glass. But something felt different. The cold remained, yet it failed to pierce through layers of cloth and skin the way it once had. The season shifted, slow enough to notice only through small changes. She walked toward the square while Thomas slept. Her boots pressed shallow prints instead of deep holes. Snow packed firm beneath. The bakery opened early again, windows cleared of ice. One worker carried sacks of flour outside to shake off stray snow. She nodded in greeting and continued. The mill doors stood open wide. Workers spoke in low tones as they checked lumber and tools. No one rushed. No one shouted orders. Boards moved from piles to wagons in steady rhythm. A crew rolled metal parts toward a repaired engine that waited for coal deliveries from the next valley. Lin paused near the pump, resting her hands on the handle. The water did not freeze overnight. That alone signaled the change. She filled a small bucket to carry home. As she turned to leave, the pastor approached with slow steps. He greeted her with a tired smile. He said the traveler she guided to the hall slept through the night without fever. His horse rested behind the shed. He planned to continue his trip after noon. Ellen nodded, grateful he found safety. The pastor looked to the sky and said winter eased its grip. Not gone, only quieter. Ellen agreed, though neither needed many words. She returned home to find Thomas awake and rubbing his eyes. He asked where she went. She handed him a cup of warm water and told him she walked to the square to check on things. He nodded, still half asleep. They spent the morning cleaning their small house. Ellen scrubbed soot from the stove. Thomas folded quilts and patched a tear along the edge. Ellen sorted their wood piles, saving longer pieces for colder nights and smaller ones for mornings. She set aside scraps for neighbors. By midday, footsteps approached outside. Ellen opened the door to Mrs. Hale, who carried a basket wrapped with cloth. She brought bread, dried berries, and 2 small candles made from leftover wax at the church. She thanked Ellen again for the days she climbed the ridge and carried sacks through the storm. Ellen accepted the basket with quiet gratitude and watched her return down the path, boots crunching lightly over firm snow. Thomas placed the candles on the table as if they held great value. He ran his fingers along their sides, as though unsure they were real. In the afternoon, Ellen helped mend window cracks at the widow's house. The child there sat near the stove, face round with warmth instead of fear. Ellen wrapped cloth around gaps where wind once slipped through. The widow placed a hand on her shoulder before she left, silent but full of meaning. On the way home, Ellen met the traveler again. He stood behind the hall, tightening straps on his saddle. His horse stamped at the ground, eager to move. He thanked Ellen for guiding him through the storm and handed her a thin strip of cloth dyed deep blue. He said it came from a town beyond the western fields where his sister worked in a sewing house. Ellen accepted the cloth and tied it around her wrist. He rode away slow, lantern swinging from the saddle. She watched him fade along the road until wind erased his tracks. By late afternoon, clouds opened slightly. A weak sun pressed through, reflecting across icy ground. People stepped outside to breathe the shift, though none spoke of spring yet. Winter remained, only less sharp. Thomas tugged Ellen's sleeve and asked to visit the river again. She agreed. The path compacted now from many feet. The river still frozen, though edges thinned near shallow stones. Children glided across the center, sliding with boards tied to shoes. Older townsfolk stood along the bank, talking in quiet voices. Ellen walked part way across the ice, cautious but calm. Thomas slid beside her, laughing softly. She looked across the river toward the ridge. Snow still covered every branch, yet wind no longer tore at them. The trees stood patient. She sat on the log where she rested nights before. The sky above held a faint glow from the lowering sun. She thought of her letter carried east, passing through valleys she never walked. She wondered if her father would reach a post station before spring thaw. She wondered if he worked in a crew camp now, sleeping near rails under thick wool blankets. She did not fear the unknown future of his letter. She sent it because the words needed to leave her hands. She hoped they reached him, though her days no longer waited on that hope. When dusk settled, she and Thomas walked home. Lanterns lit along streets. People gathered near stoops and porches, speaking of plans instead of shortages. Some prepared wagons to travel south in coming weeks. Others planned to rebuild sheds and restock stores. Inside, Ilin cooked broth again, thicker this time with dried berries and the last pieces of carrot. Thomas sat with his back against the wall, humming while he stirred with a wooden spoon. They ate slowly, letting warmth settle in their limbs. After dinner, Ellen stitched cloth from the traveller into her coat sleeve. The blue thread stood out against worn grey fabric. Thomas watched and asked if she missed the storms now that they passed. Ellen paused before answering. She said storms tested everyone, and their passing showed how people reshaped their days after hardship. He nodded, eyes heavy. As night took hold, Ellen walked outside one last time. The street silent, though not the silence of fear. Lanterns flickered behind curtains. The wind held a gentle rhythm. Snow settled without piling high. She stepped onto the road and looked toward the ridge. No tracks pulled her forward. No signals flashed from stranded families. The world felt steady. She closed her eyes and breathed through the cold. Not sharp, not biting. Only still. She returned to the house and placed 2 small logs into the stove for the night. She tucked Thomas beneath quilts and lay beside him again. The bricks warmed their feet. The stove glowed soft. This winter once pressed against every door. Now it stepped back, leaving space for breath and rest. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her without tension. Thank you for spending this night here. Slow endings hold their own comfort. Winter shifts, even when change comes quiet. Before you sleep, rest your hands and breathe through your nose, once, long enough to settle your chest. More stories wait, each with its own slow path and soft hours. I will prepare another tale soon, set in a different winter with different names. I left a small list of public records of old coal towns if you want them. For now, close your eyes and rest.